Hello YouTube. Today we're gonna take a look at a spot that I see a lot of my students make mistakes I see a lot of micro-stakes players in general make mistakes in these spots. We're gonna take a look at single raise spots out of position. I'm not gonna talk about small blind versus big blind. We're gonna talk about situations where, for example, we open hijack, button calls, all the other players fold, we see a flop, and what the hell do we do? You see a lot of mistakes there. We're going to take a look at how we can exploit those mistakes, what we can do if our opponents are being very unbalanced in these spots, and how to protect ourselves from making those mistakes. For this video, we're going to take a look at an example. We have a board of 10-7-4 on the flop, rainbow. Something maybe some people already know. In theory, we got to do a lot of checking on these boards, right? The 10-7-4, it's pretty connected. Both ranges can definitely hit this board a bit. You're gonna have open-enders here. You're gonna have 7x, 10x. You're gonna have lots of 2 overs and backdoor flush draws. And a good way a solver likes to treat these boards is, okay, we don't have a clear range advantage, right? Both can hit this board. It's pretty tough to balance out having, let's say, a betting range and a checking range. So let's just check to the in-position player, make our life a lot easier, and let him decide what to do. So this is the baseline, checking basically most of your range, and that's going to be the case on a lot of these boards. Not all boards, but a lot of these out of position boards. We want to start with a baseline of, hey, let's check a lot, right? So now what happens when we check a lot? Our opponent should be also checking quite a bit, right? You see in the solver, our opponent should be checking 45% of the time. He should be checking a lot of hands like Jack 10. He should be checking even his better 10x quite a bit. He should definitely be checking 9s, 8s, and then his over cards and backdoor flush draws are going to be like a mix between checking, betting small, betting big, right? As you can already see, this is kind of a difficult strategy to implement. And this is a thing where you're going to see in practice, lots of our opponents are going to be making mistakes here, right? You're going to see a lot of people that when they have a strong 10 here, they want to be betting, they want to protect their hand, they want to get value. They're not really going to consider the fact that we're checking range here, so they're just going to think, okay, my opponent checked, I need to go for value with the 10. Or my opponent checked, I can start bluffing with my 2 overs and backdoor flush draw. So what's going to happen is actually a lot of your opponents will be betting way too many hands. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a bit of a note log of what would be maybe a little bit of an extreme example of one of your opponents betting way too many hands here in this spot. In this extreme example, we let our opponent bet all his top pairs. We let him bet all his backdoor flush draws and 2 overcards. And this is actually something you see from players in the pool. You even see players bet a lot with 9s, 8s because they need that protection here, right? And when you checked, you're not gonna have a 10. So let's bet a lot here. And as you see, we gave our opponent lots of bets. I still made him check with some hands like ace high 2 overs, right? I don't make him go insane here with ace 9 of clubs, right? Where even some of your opponents might even step too many of those hands too, right? We don't go that extreme, but I am definitely giving my opponent here lots of bets. And after running the solver, we can basically see how can we maybe in theory then defend versus that. So once our opponent bets small, this is basically what the solver wants to do. And to have a good comparison, we can maybe go back to the original example and let's see what we want to do normally when it's just a theoretical betting range from our opponent. So when our opponent bets here, in theory, when he has a balanced range where he has lots of those checks, as we mentioned, we should be calling around 50% of the time, fold around 50% of the time, about 10% are gonna be raises. Looks normal, looks what we expect in a lot of situations versus balanced ranges, looks what we should be doing, right? Now what happens when our opponent bets too many hands? Let's take a look at that. So this is basically when our opponent bets too many hands, and you can immediately see the huge difference here. We do almost no calling anymore, right? Because our EV of raising goes up tremendously. We're up against the merged range, we're up against a range with lots of weak hands like 9s, 8s, as we mentioned, Jack 10s, that can probably defend versus a small raise, but versus a big raise is in a very tough spot already. Versus small raise and a barrel on the turn, people are gonna hate their lives here with 9s, 8s. Even hand like 10-9 is not gonna be thrilled about calling you down in these spots. That's why solver's like, hey, fuck you, you're not supposed to bet this many hands, let's go raise a lot. And you see that we're raising mainly for value, right? There's going to be lots of hands we suddenly want to bet for way bigger sizing. As you maybe saw aces, kings, queens, jacks. Previously we also raised, but usually for a smaller sizing. Here we suddenly want to bomb it with these hands, right? And then almost all of our 10x want to be raising, usually a bit for a smaller sizing. And then we're going to also kind of value bluff raise these ace queens with a backdoor flush draws, ace king with a backdoor flush, king queen with a backdoor flush draws. Hands that have lots of playability on future seats and also kinda have so much equity that it's basically a value range. Plus it makes it easy to balance out our best over pairs, right? Plus also having some of these hands. And we can go insane, right? We're only folding 35%. It's a little bit less, not a lot, but the main difference is going to be here hands that we usually want to be calling. Against a range like this, we can suddenly start raising a lot and with way bigger sizings. And then maybe if no, in the solution, I didn't go too much in depth on this. We can take a look at, okay, so how do you play turns? And you're going to see it, especially if you use a small sizing, we are going to do lots of betting on lots of turns. Like, let's take a random deuce of hearts. We're gonna bet 60% of the time still on the turn. So we are gonna keep putting on the pressure, which makes sense, right? If your opponent still has a lot, relatively speaking, lots of his 10x in his range, lots of 9s and 8s still in his range, right? Some floats he should be having in theory. It's gonna be very tough for him to defend with those hands, right? As you can see here, hand like 9s is a mix on the turn, and that should already tell you that it's very tough for your opponent to find balance here. Also with Jack 10, he should be calling, but he's not gonna love life, as we already mentioned before. While in the original example, we bet a little bit less, not a lot, it's 55 compared to 60%, so not a big thing, but you should see that your opponent should have an easier time continuing here, right? He's allowed to now fold his 9s and 8s, right? He shouldn't have too many of these weaker 10x, so he should mainly have stronger eggs that continue, and the life of your opponent becomes a lot easier when he actually uses a decent correct sizing on the flop. Right, where if he becomes unbalanced and you start exploiting that, you put him in really tough spots. And that's what we're always trying to do in poker, obviously. Now, there's one thing that's even more important here than the raising more instead of calling. And you can maybe already guess it, but that's when our opponent checks. And let's take a little look here. Let's say a flop goes check, check. And this is purely in theory again. And our opponent checks is 40% of the time, which he should. Then we bet about 50-50 on the turn, because your opponent should still have some pretty strong hands. We can start betting some more hands for value, but other hands still want to be cautious here on the turn, right? We cannot really go ham in these spots. We need to find like the best hands to be betting with here on the turn and still do lots of checking. Now, when we would go to our exploitative solution and our opponent checks only 22% of the time, now this is the part where you can go ham. This is where the solver basically, you could say, almost bets range, right? It bets 80% of the time here, and it's maybe not gonna bet with some ace queens, but for example, it wants to bet ace king for value already at this point, right? Which is insane, right? On a board like this, we can suddenly start betting ace king for value, and then all our weakest ace x we can start turning into a bluff. All our king x suited, all our queen x suited, right? All of those basically become bluffs. At the same time, with our best hands, we can go for value, so it's not like we have to worry too much. We're still gonna have strong hands in there. It's just because our opponent's range becomes so weak. Because if he bets all his top pairs, if he bets all his 9s, 8s, and 2 overfitted backdoor flush draw, there are going to be so many turns where our opponent doesn't improve on and just has a really tough time continuing. For example, if we bet here for half pot, our opponent needs to call here with ace queen to find enough hands to call, right? And that's gonna be where your opponent is gonna have a really tough time continuing in these spots. Now we're also gonna take a look at another example. As for example, let's take the same spot and let's take something that you also see quite a lot on micro stakes, and something that I also see quite often from my students is what happens if we now in the hijack start betting too much. Or let's say we're on the button, we flat call the hand for whatever reason. There might be some spots where it's okay to flat, even though in general, because of the rake, we don't want to do too much flatting. Still, let's take a look at those spots where our opponent maybe are stabbing a bit too much, right? What happens then? Or, for example, let's say we stab too much. What's really gonna happen then in theory? In this case, I made us bet, let's say, our best 10x, right? Makes sense. You see a lot of people do this. Just bet their best 10x. Bet all their over pairs, right? Maybe some of the weaker 10x people start checking. 9s, 8, sure, we can check here. It's a bit different because we're out of position against what we perceive more as an uncapped range, where previously our opponent maybe perceived us as having a capped range. Like here, a lot of people will think, oh, okay, let's just bet our 10x for value, but let's have some bluffs too, right? Let's have king, queen of spades, king, queen of diamonds, king, queen of hearts, right? Again, like these hands that feel very natural as bluff, or even better, 9-8 suited, right? 6-5 suited. Let's bet all of those, right? And then lots of hands, let's say also with possible backdoor flush draw and backdoor straight draw. Let's give our opponent here like quite a bit of hands. Let's make him bet like 40%. We're not even going very extreme. We're not betting range, which some people will do. We're just letting him bet a bit more than we're maybe used to. And let's see what changes in comparison to the original theoretical sim. If we look at this original sim, and let's take a look at the hands solver wants to bet like 10% of the time, right? Let's say if your opponent bets 33% here, how are you supposed to react? Well, you're supposed to call 70% of the time, do like 15% raising, 50% folding, right? You're gonna continue quite a bit. Now, what happens, let's say if we give our opponent the 50% with the range we just mentioned. And you see again that we're gonna start doing lots more raises. The sizing is a little bit different in the sim, but still, normally against smaller sizings we're allowed to raise more, and here we're actually up against bigger sizing and we still do more raising. We're raising 25% of the time here, so we're gonna put again way more pressure on that more mergy range, on that range that has more mediocre hands in a spot where we can still have all those strong hands. Again, we're still gonna have a lot of those strongest 10x. We're still gonna have sets here, and we can start mixing in a lot of hands with, for example, 2 overs and backdoor flush draw. We can start raising more with our straight draws here in these spots, and then also our 10s, 7s, 4s also can start raising more for value. And then again, same thing, let's take a look. Okay, so what if our opponent bets all these hands, but then we get in a situation where he checks. And now you can see there's no checks anymore. There's 0 checks, and this is actually insane. So when our opponent would be having a checking range and a betting range instead of checking most of the range here, we're suddenly allowed to do what we previously saw we shouldn't do, right? We're suddenly allowed to bet way too many hands, because our opponent again is gonna be very capped when he checks here. He's not gonna have those best 10x in his range anymore. Sure, maybe he checks something like pocket 10s or pocket aces, but he's just in general, looking at his whole range, just not gonna have enough hands to continue here versus bet with. Let's say we go 75% here, our opponent is supposed to fold 70% of the time, right? Which is awful for him in a spot like this. And then here hands he continue are still gonna be in really tough spots on turns and rivers. Now you might be start thinking at this point, hey, but Peter, if I do this, won't some better opponents know, hey, I can now check raising a lot like we saw in the previous example? Well, this is actually the thing that's always gonna happen when you play exploitative poker, right? If you assume your opponent bets too many hands on the flop, you can get away with this. Now, if you're wrong, then you're gonna start losing money again, right? So a really good thing to do here in these situations is start with a baseline, start with the theoretical baseline, start with a, okay, if I'm here in position, I'm gonna be checking most of my range on a lot of these boards, right? And then if my opponent oversteps, we can start raising a lot. If we don't have any ID, let's just play a normal range. Let's just assume he's balanced, right? Same thing for us here. If we don't know our opponent, we should assume he has better hands that he's checking. We shouldn't be betting our range because we open up ourselves to be exploited in these situations. Now, how do we make this exploitant? Well, you should be paying attention. If, let's say, you play a single raise spot out position and you play it kind of theoretical, you try to balance out your range a bit. It's not going to be perfect, but at least you're not going to be massively imbalanced like in this example. And you see your opponent show up with a hand where, hey, he was supposed to check here on the flop, or he was supposed to bet. Now you can start thinking, okay, if he does that, we suddenly want to start check raising a lot. Or if we're the in position player, we can start betting a lot more. And it's always important to just have these tools, these possibilities in your arsenal. Because whenever you're aware of your opponent making a mistake like this, the EV of your range can go up tremendously if you know how to exploit your opponents. And that's where you always can make a lot of money in poker. So if you recognize yourself in one of these opponents that bets too much when he's supposed to check range, or bets too much when his opponent is checking towards him, beware, be careful in these spots. You can potentially lose lots of EVs in these spots if you're playing these wrong. At the same time, beware. Keep an eye on your opponents. You can make a lot of EV if you recognize, if you can target some of these opponents who make the plays that we saw in today's video. So try to use that, exploit your opponents and take the max. But if you have no ID, try to go to that baseline. And remember, single raise spots out of position, you should be checking a lot, both of you.